Welcome to the Authentic Change Podcast. I'm Mike Horn, your host, and this podcast is for leaders and coaches who need and want fresh perspectives on what it means to live and to lead authentically. You're a leader who wants to make a difference, but sometimes you feel stuck. You know there's more to life and to leadership than what you're currently experiencing. It can be tough to figure out how to grow as a leader. You might be reading all the blogs and books, but it still feels like you're not making progress. You might even be feeling like you're doing everything wrong. On Authentic Change with Mike Horn, we interview experts who share their insights on how to live and lead authentically. Our guests are trendsetters in building great leaders, teams, and organizations. We provide fresh perspectives on what it means to live with purpose and authenticity. Welcome to this episode of the Authentic Change Podcast.
Welcome to this episode of the Authentic Change Podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to have in our virtual studio today, Douglas Spencer. And Douglas has a firm called Spencer Brenneman, but I'm going to let him tell you more about that and how it all ties together. Douglas is an expert on messaging, a former executive global brand head at Thomson Reuters. He brings his wisdom and his experience to helping people work on their messaging strategies, what other people might call brand strategies. And Douglas, I'm absolutely delighted to be with you today in our virtual studio. How about telling our audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, Mike, thank you for having me. This is, I always love the opportunity to talk about authenticity because it's so integral to having a good message, a message that works. But yeah, like you said, I am a brand strategist, marketing person, messaging strategist, and I've had my own firm for about 9 years. And we focus on helping mission-driven organizations take a step back, think about who they are in this moment, and what is the best way to talk about their work that's authentic, that is differentiated, that has the right amount of emotional pull, and how do we get them to talk about it in a way that people want to join them in their efforts?
How did you end up here, Douglas? What created your pathway to this work?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because it certainly wasn't planned. It certainly wasn't. I didn't go to college so I could become a messaging strategist in 40 years. I studied journalism in college because I thought I was going to do English, but then I decided I wanted to do journalism, which was a great foundation for me because it really employed a lot of writing and critical thinking, but also it helped me learn a little bit about a new topic very quickly, just to the point where I could be able to talk somewhat reasonably intelligently about it, right? So it was a really great foundation. I highly recommend it. I've never worked as a journalist, but I started doing PR for a magazine and advertising sales. I did PR for a hospital at one point, did some freelance writing. Then I started doing marketing for a technology firm, boutique marketing firm. I'm in Boston. I have been in Boston now for a number of years. And then I moved on to what became Thomson Reuters. I was there for 16 years and I left as the global head of brand, which was a fantastic experience. We got to put together about 5 businesses on the Thomson side and 2 businesses on the Reuters side to bring together the Thomson Reuters business. I used to say that my job was getting 60,000 people around the world to act like they worked for the same company.
Herding cats.
Exactly. But it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. It was great. But then it was time, 16 years is a long time. And I decided it was time to go out on my own. And I've been doing this, like I said, for 9 years, helping mostly smaller and mid-sized companies or, as I said, mission-driven organizations with their messaging.
I think most of my listening audience, they don't know this part about me. But I was also attracted to journalism. I was, editor of the high school newspaper, editor of the high school yearbook. And I think I learned my most important lesson in writing from my high school journalism teacher. And it's not a novel idea. It's one that people talk about all the time. But it was the lesson that, good stories aren't written, they're rewritten. And how, the process of writing and speaking your truth and getting out your message often requires some careful construct or some careful thinking about that. And I'm particularly curious in this, era of everybody needs a brand, personal branding, and thinking about that. Where does authenticity fit into that? And thinking about authenticity in terms of, congruence between what we think, say, and do.
Great question. There's a lot of layers to that. So let's see how many we can uncover. When I think about authenticity now, I think that we certainly have a much bigger appetite for it than we did, say, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And as much as people like to make fun of millennials, I really want to give them credit. I think millennials are the ones that really drove this idea of how important authenticity is. Data show that millennials in particular will change brands if the brands aren't aligned. They will take a pay cut and work for a company that is more in line with who they believe, what they believe, and who they are. And then if you look at what happened during the pandemic, of course, the Great Resignation, I think people people became fed up with just going through the motions of things. And so there really has to be some sort of connection, some emotional connection with what we do and how we talk about it. And I think that that's a good thing. I think it really is. And we're so used to people telling us what they think we want to hear. So our cynicism has never been higher, which again, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It keeps us on our toes, and it keeps leaders who want to lead in authentic ways. It keeps them on their toes. And it's really, really important.
Now that, thinking about the context of working, going to a job, belonging to an organization, in many ways, the office is dead for many people. How does it work in terms of thinking about branding for an organization or thinking about the messaging for an organization in this new era of, less time in the office? Doesn't mean less time with work. But does that play a role in any of the way that we think about messaging and think about the importance of messaging, our distance from office spaces?
That's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about it in that specific way. I do think that internal communications or employee communications has always been something that organizations need to work on and have never really done it, have never given it enough face time. But I think now that we are much more of a distributed workforce, then internal comms plays an even bigger role. And when we start working with clients, we always position it as not your prospects or your clients or your donors or your funders. It's about all the people who are integral to your success. And that always, always, always includes employees. And I think that when people traditionally go about thinking about branding and messaging, they think exclusively externally, which is such a mistake and such a missed opportunity. Because as you know, there's no such thing as internal only, right? And I also like to point out that language is contagious. Think about all of the things you say that you picked up from popular culture, your partner, your family, your culture. The way we speak internally is the way we speak externally. So the message that you have for your employees has got to be the same one you have for the people outside your organization. And so that's a roundabout way of saying, I guess, that it's even more important, but it's always been important, that we really think about messaging holistically and not just as a tactic, not just as something we have to do, but it's really about who we are as organizations and who we are as employers, who we are as service providers, who we are as managers, as leaders. So messaging really has to be integral to everything we do and not just something that we feel like we have to do.
And it's so wonderful that you have a focus, I think, on working with purpose-driven leaders. Say some more about that. I mean, how do these people find you? How do you locate them? What's at work here?
Well, I'm very lucky. I would say 95% of my clients, if not more, come to me through referrals, people who know me or worked with me before. So that's really how people find me. But, the one thing that I've learned working with mission-driven or what I call social entrepreneurs is that's the same as working with any kind of entrepreneur, is that the great thing about them is that they love to solve problems. But the challenging thing about them is that they love to solve problems. And the work that we do with clients, we help them find focus. and determine, before they can talk about how they're different from all the other options people have, they have to really articulate what that is, and they have to stick to it. So what we try to do is get organizations to think about who they are, what makes them different, and commit to that. And if there's a problem that shows up that doesn't fit into, say, one of those buckets, then they refer it to somebody else for whom that is a focus. And we really get them to think about where do they focus their time and their energies on solving problems so that they can stay consistent, so their message can stay authentic, and that they can stay connected with the people, again, most important to their success.
And everyone can learn more about Douglas at spencerbrenneman.com. It'll be in the show notes, and that's a way to get in touch with Douglas and to find out what he does and what his firm does at spencerbrenneman.com. But let's talk about the Brenneman part of this. How does that fit in to the world, Douglas?
Well, so my surname is Spencer, and it is a pretty common name. But my mother's maiden name was Brenneman, so I wanted to pay homage to both sides of my family because I got a lot out of both of them. I got a strong work ethic from the Spencers and a lot of creativity from the Brennemans, which is not to say that the Brennemans didn't have a strong work ethic. Just to make that clear in case anybody hears this, or that the Spencers weren't creative. But you get my point. Just because Spencer was a very generic name, I put it together, and that's how you have it. It's sometimes I think it's kind of ironic for a branding person to pick such a challenging URL for people to remember. I should have thought that through. But we do have what we call a vanity URL, and so if it's easy to remember, you can go to message.builders/ABC, which stands for our methodology, which is Ask, Build, and Connect. So message.builders/ABC.
Oh, that's great. We'll have all of that in the show notes, and to think about, really learning more about Spencer Brenneman and what they do, visit either of those sites. And I assume they'll point everyone to a similar pathway.
Oh, sure.
Okay, great.
Oh,
SpencerBrenneman.com. And I'm curious about so many things on such an interesting topic related to messaging. One thing that I heard you say is that part of working with a client is to understand who they are, maybe a critical part, or as you're working with an entity, whether that's an individual or a team or an organization, it's really getting to understand, for effective messaging, that identity question. And for many of our listeners, we talk about self-awareness as foundational to authentic leadership. How do you begin to unpack that for somebody who may not be familiar with all of these terms? And
Sure. Well, the way we start is really with the question, why? Why do you do what you do? Why do you care? And more importantly, why should anybody else care? And, when you first ask that question to somebody, they say, well, isn't it obvious? Well, maybe, but I want to hear you say. I want to hear you. And you keep pushing them and having them really investigate why it is they do what they do. Because most of us, or many of us, can make a living in any number of ways. And so why is it you have chosen this particular way? And I think if you're going to be an authentic leader, people have to know that. They have to respect that. They have to feel it. And so that can help drive your message from a point of consistency if you stay true to why you do what you do in the first place. For us, that's really the core element of how you start to find an authentic message.
Maybe all of leadership can be boiled down to two ideas. One is that authentic leaders care. They care about something. And secondly, that they're willing to do something about it.
Right.
And maybe that's how we reduce all of this. So getting to this question about, when you ask someone, why do you care? Why should anyone care? As you explore those topics with people, what are some of the methods that you might use, or some of the techniques that you might use to help people uncover that understanding, a better understanding of themselves, just as we do in executive coaching with certain methods and techniques to help people understand and to increase their self-awareness? What do you do in terms of a messaging context so important to so many of our listeners?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what we do is, as I said, we have a methodology, Ask, Build, and Connect. The first one is ask. We ask a lot of questions. We ask a lot of questions not only of the leaders, but of the people they work with. We ask questions of, their donors or customers, or again, anyone that's important to the success. We do that qualitatively, and then we do it quantitatively. And the important element of that in process is that once we report back to the leader or leaders, it helps remind them of the impact they're having. So for example, if we talk to someone who benefited from the work that their organization did and share an anecdote or story, then that helps ignite a thought or a memory, even if it's just clean, pure data. Like 80, and I'm making this up, obviously, 80% of donors wouldn't want to donate anywhere else, or 80% of customers wouldn't want to go anywhere else. And that helps kind of spark a little remembrance of why they're there. So it can't be done in a vacuum. It has to be done with the benefit of other people being around. I remember one time in particular, this is before we started focusing on mission-driven organizations, and we had a client who did tax strategy. And we presented all of our research, and we were going through a workshop about different things. And I was watching the CEO, and I, honest to gosh, feel like I saw him fall back in love with taxes, with tax strategy, because the way his face changed, and he was just kind of remembering what it was like when he first started. He had been a partner at one of the big, at that time, six, and so he just kind of got excited again. And I think that whole process really does help people tap into their why, tap into their authenticity.
I love this framework that Douglas Spencer uses, which is ask, build, and connect. Typically in my coaching work, I'm thinking about three things that need to happen. One is to catalyze a relationship. How do we catalyze this? How do we get it started? Well, how do we think about goals? And then I'm working on capitalizing, not, capitalizing on strengths, on identity, as opposed to a focus on, let's fix deficiencies or what others might identify as problems. And then this third aspect of conditioning, so that you're able to repeat, that you're able to step it up, at a different level when circumstances change, as they always do. So as you think about ask, build, connect, are you working on a set of strengths with people? Or are you correcting deficiencies? How does that begin to, fall into this messaging work? Because we have those, right? Both strengths and weaknesses.
Absolutely. And, a lot of messaging and branding is aspirational. And, one of the things that we spend a lot of time going through is, what is it you can do better? What is it you're not doing well? So you focus on what you do well, but you keep in mind all of the things that you don't do well, right? And you start working on them if they're important. And if you don't do them well, but they're not really that important, then you stop even thinking, you stop doing them. You stop trying to do it. Again, it goes back to focus. We help organizations focus on what they do best relative to what is needed most. So that's how we help them think about conditioning. And if it all goes back to one goal, then it's a lot easier to stay top of mind, keep what's important top of mind, because it's a way that it all ladders up. So how you do what you do is directly related to what you do, which is directly related to why it is you exist.
This will resonate with so many people in our audience. And the question that might be on someone's mind or a listener's mind as they listen to this podcast is, do I have to be a big company in order to work with Douglas Spencer? Or what size of organization do I need to be? Can I be an individual who's seeking out his or her or their own messaging or branding?
Absolutely. You don't need to be a large company. In fact, we don't typically work with large organizations. We work with smaller to mid-sized companies just because we don't have the bandwidth to do that, nor do we want to. We want to keep it a very boutique, very small organization. And, quite frankly, I don't want to work that hard. I want to work hard for a few organizations, but not hard for a ton of organizations, right? We want to make certain that we are right-sized for our clients as well as right-focused. And in terms of individuals, I don't do personal branding because I think that's a very specific discipline. It's a very specific approach. And it's less about branding than I think it is about, more like what you do in coaching and getting people to think about, how can they be better leaders? How can they be known for how they work and what are they known? But we will work with solopreneurs, with individuals that have their own business, And that's often important because I think a lot of people just throw their name out there and then think that they're going to be a consultant, and that works many times. But other times, if you have a goal of selling your business at some point, you need to think about that a little bit differently, right? So, there's a whole lot of things that go into it, which is a long-winded way of saying, yes, we'll work with solopreneurs. Yes, we'll work with small and mid-sized companies, and we probably are not a good fit for large corporations.
And as a person who's received some branding advice or messaging advice from time to time as a published author like yourself, thinking about how do I, sell this piece of writing, or how do I promote my expertise in a different way. I think I've had a number of people who have tried to help me with that. And it's always a struggle about, for me, is knowing when it's done and knowing when it's right, and that I can stick with this message that will resonate with people for the next 10 years or however long I think about this phase or portion of my career and being helpful to clients. How often do we come back to these messaging strategies? What's the thought on that?
That's a really great question, and something we talk about a lot. I think your authenticity, your message and the authenticity that it's built on needs continual monitoring, not necessarily change, but definitely monitoring. And there's two reasons for that. The first is, the way I like to explain it is, if you're looking straight ahead at the goal of what you want to accomplish, then you create a message that adjusts to it. But then as life changes, as needs change, you tweak your focus a little bit, say to the right. And then, maybe the next year you tweak it a little bit more to the right. And then the needs change even more, but your message is still pointing in that same original direction. So that's when the message starts to fall apart, when it starts to become ineffective, when it starts to become out of date. And the other reason that constant monitoring is important is that I like to say that we all forget what's inside our head, but not in anybody else's. We all work so incredibly hard. We work at trying to, we live and breathe and dream about what we do. And we forget that not everybody has that level of intimacy with our work. And so it's so easy for us, everybody, so easy just to forget about what's just in our head and not somebody else's. It's like, as I like to say, it's like describing a Netflix series, season 3, episode 7, to someone who's only seen season 1, episode 4, right? So, we get so far ahead in our heads that our message sometimes falls behind. And so if you're constantly monitoring your message, then you're able to keep it on track and keep it real for the people who need to hear it.
It's so interesting because my last book was published about 1.5 years ago, and I'm getting ready to think about launching a second book. Not getting ready to think about it. I mean, we'll launch a second book. I threw the second book I wrote into the trash can because after some feedback, I don't think my topic appealed to a wide enough audience. That I was working for a very narrowly focused audience, which has some benefits and some pluses, and I can still do a lot of work with that material. But I made a change, about 6 months ago, because the first year of that was, let's really do book promotion. Let's, get this message out there, because as an expensive business card, it has some lifetime to it, a life cycle. But we've shifted in the last 3 or 4 months to use this year in advance of the next book to focus on, Mike Horn as executive coach and organization development consultant. So that required some shift, not necessarily, it did require a shift in our messaging and the way that we hit people. It didn't change anything about who I am or the core or how I might interact with folks. So it's really helpful to think about the pacing and the timing of when it's important to think about tweaks or wholesale overviews to your messaging. When does somebody know when it's right to do that?
Well, I think they know there's a lot of different triggers. My answer for everything marketing or messaging or branding is it depends, right? So it depends on what it is you're doing. But, for example, if you're suddenly seeing a revolving door of employees, then your messaging might be wrong. Or same with any kind of the relationships that are important to you. If the turnover in your relationships is larger than it should be, then that's a sign. If you're not getting the same kind of engagement with, again, those people that are important to your success, it's time for a review. If there's somebody else in the market that's doing what you're doing or doing something akin to it, then it's time to look at what you're doing. And, maybe it's sometimes if you add services. We have a client now that we're refreshing their brand because they've added services. And we were going through internally, we were doing some work on it just recently. And someone said, well, that's not much different than what they have originally. I said, well, there is value in the validation that you get that that at least that part of their message is still working. And so there's value in having that validation too. So even if you don't end up changing your message considerably, if you do the work just to make certain it is working, that's important work to do as well.
How do we help to get other people to care about our message? Do I have to advertise a lot, or in terms of getting that message out to others? Let's say you're working with a solopreneur. The space that I work in, has as well as many members of our listening audience, the barriers to entry they're tiny. You put a shingle out, put a coat. How do you drive that caring that, I want to care about Mike Horn and Leadership Acts, or I want to care about, Douglas Spencer's firm, Spencer Brenneman, in a very noisy, very crowded market. Think about it in terms of books, right? I mean, very crowded marketplaces. How do we get other people to care about our work?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think one way is realizing that you're not going to get everybody to care for your work. You've got to decide who are the people that for whom it's most important for them to understand your work. So stop trying to get everybody excited about what you do and to care, because guess what? Not everybody's going to care. So really get crystal clear on who is important to you. And more importantly, perhaps, whom can you help the most? Think about them and go after them with your authentic message, your authentic, compelling and memorable message. Find out who it is that really needs to hear what you have to say. And that's going to make things a whole lot easier.
Identifying your customers, identifying your target markets, describing them in some detail so that you can create some focus. Douglas, what I'm thinking about is the concept of integrity. And as I think about integrity, it's about being the real deal, the genuine article. Some people might describe it as being of whole cloth, as another way of thinking about it. If I was a structural engineer, most of my clients are scientists and engineers and technologists, to think about this concept of, how they would describe integrity is it all hangs together sort of in the right way. So how does the concept of integrity come into your work so that perhaps clients are promoting some future vision of themselves? Or I'm guessing that you want to capture both. You want to capture sort of current state and an anticipated state. How's that concept of integrity factor into your work? I know it does factor into your work. Could you be descriptive about that, or is it?
Gosh, integrity is one of those topics that it's so hard to talk about without dripping in cliches. The one about integrity is what you do when nobody's looking, or you're doing the right thing when nobody's looking, that kind of thing. But in terms of the whole idea of being aspirational, and so your message has to have a balance of grounded in reality, right? And it also has to have some aspiration to it. And one of the ways that we try to get clients to think about that is what we call the ways. So what are the ways that your message comes to life? Or if your organization were a person, what's some of the adjectives you would use to describe them? So we have clients that use adjectives like ardent, like passionate, caring, focused, and there can be a whole different host. But if these are kind of principles that you always think about in terms of how your message comes to life, that helps you maintain a level of integrity with your message that presumably matches who you really are, right? And when you think about integrity, it comes back to our original topic of authenticity, right? Integrity is all about setting expectations. This is who I am, and this is what you get, right? Authenticity, I think, is very closely intertwined with integrity.
Let's talk for a moment about storytelling and how we, get brands or organizations or solopreneurs to talk about, to use storytelling in their work. How does that work, Douglas?
Right. I like to look at storytelling as proof points for what you've been saying. right? So if you say that you're an organization that supports victims of child abuse, so you tell the story, not necessarily of a specific child, but you tell a story of what children go through when they experience that, and all the different people, all the adults that are responsible or important to that child recovering from what they're going through. And you tell it in a way that reinforces, or that backs up rather, what it is you say you do. So if it's about providing the most up-to-date training for those individuals, for the social workers, the nurse practitioners, the law enforcement, so that you tell a story in the context of why that's important. And you have to, so storytelling is only works when it has a purpose, when it is aligned to what you're trying to accomplish overall. And so when you think about telling stories, you can't tell stories just for the sake of telling stories unless you're at a cocktail party. But, in real life, at work, and when you're trying to further what you do, you've got to think about it in terms of its purpose. What do you want people to feel after they hear your story? Not do. Stories should not be, you don't use storytelling to get people to necessarily do something. You want to get them to feel something about your work, about your organization, about the service you offer, the people you help. You want something to feel something, because as human beings, we make decisions both analytically and emotionally. And most of the time, it's the emotional decision that's the real driver, and we use the analytics just to back it up. We want your stories to get people to feel something in line with what you're trying to accomplish.
So if I need expertise in marketing consulting, brand marketing, content strategy, nonprofit consulting, brand consulting, these are the kinds of services in many ways that you're providing for mission-driven organizations, purpose-driven organizations. I've always been a person attracted to mission-driven organizations. I'm attracted to, that's, I think, what's attracted me to working with scientists and engineers and technologists, people in healthcare and pharmaceuticals who are trying to make things better in some way for the world. Do you find that across all of your clients? So, for example, could you work on the same thing with a refuse disposal company as a company trying to cure cancer, or a company trying to combat climate change? How do you make those selections and determinations?
That's a great question. Well, I think it depends, as I always say. It depends on the refuse company. If they're trying to do what they do, let's face it, but their work is important, right? We need people to do that. But if they're trying to do it in a way that has integrity, that is trying to solve the problems that we face in our environment, if they're trying to do something better in a way that not only makes the money, because there's nothing wrong with making money, but if they try to do that in a way that is better for everyone, then sure, I'll work with them. But if it's an organization that's really just focused on shareholder value and very little else, then there's going to be another agency that's probably a better choice for them. But in terms of the actual mechanics of it all, yeah, I think the mechanics are all pretty similar. This whole question of why do you do what you do, and what do you do, and how do you do it differently? I think the mechanics of that are the same. It's just a matter of how, it's a lot easier to talk about the why of protecting victims of child abuse than it is to talk about CHAC strategy, right? But you can still do it. You can still find whys in everything.
As we begin to wrap up and consider issues in messaging and brand development, particularly for solopreneurs, where would they start? How do they start this process? Do they already have to have a product or something? Where does that start?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think what they have to start with is looking at what it is, and I used this phrase before, but I like to use it a lot, is think about what it is they do best relative to what's needed most, right? I might be able to quote 30 Rock, but that's nothing that anybody cares about, right? So what is a skill set that you have that people that actually need, but you do it really well? And then you've determined who those people are, like we talked about. So first of all, don't try to be all things to all people, especially right away. And if you are someone that if you're lucky enough to have a lot of different skill sets, then pick one. Pick one. And then you can always add on later. But pick one thing in particular that is indicative of all the other work you can do. And pick one type of customer and focus on that and them. And then as you learn, because being a solopreneur is all about learning every single day. Think about, as you learn, as you grow, think about maybe you should add, maybe you shouldn't add, but just start small and build up.
Great guidance and advice, Douglas. When our listening audience or their colleagues want to begin some serious work on messaging and branding, I can point them to ways to get in touch with you. But how would you like people to be in touch with you in this regard?
Certainly through the website is a great way. I'm on LinkedIn. Despite the fact that my name is pretty generic, I guess I am the first Douglas Spencer to get there. So, just type in Douglas Spencer on LinkedIn and you can find me. I love connecting and talking with people. I'm always happy to have a conversation with someone, even if they're just thinking things through. Obviously I'll do it no charge just to help people think about what they need to do. So yeah, look me up. I'm always happy to have a conversation.
I really appreciate your generosity, Douglas, your spirit to serve, your dedication and focus on messaging and branding at many different levels, from individuals, solopreneurs, to organizations of substance. So it's been a great delight for me, and I'm sure it will be for our audience, and to hear your words of wisdom and your generous offer to make yourself available for discussion. I'm going to leave a couple of last words to you and wrap up.
Well, great. Well, thank you. This has been a great conversation. I've done a lot of podcasts, and sometimes the conversations are a little stiff, but this has just been a lovely experience, and it's flowed from one question to the next without effort. So thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for being such a gracious and skilled host.
Well, thank you so much. And again, please visit Douglas Spencer at spencerbrenneman.com. You'll find it in the show notes, the ways to get there. So until our next episode of Authentic Change with Mike Horn, stay well.
Thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast. I'm delighted that you've tuned in to listen. Please visit the show notes for links to topics discussed in today's podcast. To download a free ebook on authentic change and leadership and to subscribe to my newsletter, please visit mike-horn.com. Once again, mike-horne.com, mike-horn.com. Once again, thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast.